Hi everyone, welcome back after a short week's break. In today's episode, we are going to be covering the new and developing Lindsay Clancy case. Okay, so before I get into it, I just want to say that I am doing this podcast episode solo this week. Ashley was with her family in Disney last week, and unfortunately this week she has a pretty bad cold and lost her voice, so it will just be me this week. That being said, she does want to weigh in on this case and give a mother's perspective, so we will be talking about this case more in depth next week, and we're hoping we'll have some updates for you then. So going right into it, Lindsay Clancy was a 32-year-old mother from Duxbury, Massachusetts. She was married to her husband Patrick, and they shared 3 kids together: Cora, age 5, Dawson, age 3, and Callan, 8 months old. She was a labor and delivery nurse, and her husband Patrick worked from home. And everybody around her described her as a generous, kind person. She loved her job. She was a great wife, a loving mother, a great mother, and just an overall great person. So going into towards the evening hours of January 24th, Patrick Clancy left the residence to pick up a takeout order that him and his wife had placed, and he also stopped at CVS as well. And when he came back, he had found that Lindsay had strangled all 3 of their children and tried to commit suicide by cutting her own wrists and jumping out of a second-story window. She still remains in the hospital, and we now know that she does have some pretty severe injuries. Her defense team said that she is paralyzed from the waist down, and she's not expected to regain motion or movement in her legs. This story is so heartbreaking. It caught everybody's attention, and it definitely has raised a lot of questions as to why, what happened. Was this a case of postpartum depression, anxiety, psychosis? What made her do these things? And for those of you who don't know what postpartum depression, anxiety, psychosis, things like that are, postpartum is after you have a baby. Your hormones are just kind of everywhere and out of whack, and sometimes you can develop postpartum depression, anxiety, psychosis, and these things are very, very scary. There's a long list of things that you can develop after being a mom, and I will say that in this country, it is not taken seriously enough. There is not enough mental health help. There is not enough postpartum help for new mothers. There is just overall not enough of that. And it's so sad that as a result of these new mothers and women not getting help, that things like this can happen. We now know that Lindsay Clancy was indeed struggling. 3 weeks before this incident, she checked herself into a mental hospital. She was on a long list of medications. She was seeing a psychiatrist. She was in, I think, some type of intensive program, and she was getting help. You know, her family knew that she was sick. Her husband knew. Her mom knew. Everybody around her knew that she was sick. She was open about it on a social media post. She talked about how she struggled with postpartum anxiety, and she, in quotes, said she felt dialed in. So these things were very present in her life. She was definitely struggling after she had just had this last baby that they had. So going into the arraignment hearing, which was this past Tuesday, she joined via Zoom because she is still in the hospital. It was really hard to see her. She was laying down at a weird angle. She was still in a neck brace from what I could see. She had a mask over her face though, so you could only really see her eyes. But she did join via Zoom, and we got to hear from both the prosecution and the defense. And I will say that both sides are very strong. I was shocked at what I heard from the prosecution because it was just a bunch of new updates that we didn't know and factors in this case that we didn't know that sort of made me question how I feel about this. But kind of going into what the prosecution said, they kind of talked about what happened, and, you know, they revealed that Lindsay was indeed the one to text Patrick and say, want to get takeout from 3V, and she had also Googled how long it would take somebody to get from their house to 3V, so she knew the timing of how fast she needed or how long she had to commit these crimes. And so they obviously argued that this was a premeditated, planned out thing. And I didn't think this was a planned out or premeditated thing. I don't think anybody thought that. So I think this was definitely shocking to hear these pieces of evidence being presented. So a little bit more of what the prosecution went on to talk about. They revealed that she journaled her day-to-day life and how her days went and how she was feeling. And she never said the word postpartum psychosis or never said she had homicidal thoughts. So they were arguing that this was in fact not a case of postpartum psychosis and that she wasn't having any psychosis episode and that she planned and executed these murders. And another thing that came out on prosecution's side was the manner of death. We did know that it was strangulation, but we now know that she strangled all 3 of the children with an exercise band, and it was so tightly around their neck. They described it as you would have to wait until the person that you were strangling passed out. And she did this 3 times over. So the prosecution was arguing how violent and how terrible that was. And on defense side, they argued that Lindsay was heavily over-medicated. They named off a list of medications that she was on, and it's a lot. I think for anybody to be on that long of a list of medications, it's not good. I can't help but think what that does to somebody's mind, somebody's health, somebody's body. And to pair that with being postpartum and your hormones being all over the place, it's just, it can't be good. So they argued that she was heavily over-medicated and that she was indeed struggling. She talked about it. Everybody knew she was seeking the help and trying to get help for it. And they also talked about how she was such a loving mother and that this is in no way planned or this was in no way premeditated, that she loved her kids and everybody knew that. And prior to this, she was having a normal day with them. This was not something that she planned. And they did do a really good job of kind of talking about how she, was a loving mother. They pulled out, I think they called it like a wish well or a wish box, where she wrote little notes of how she wanted her kids to grow up and do good things and that she was hoping that they would be happy and successful and that she would be there to see it. So they talked about how could this be something that she planned, and she was such a loving and active mother and such a loving wife, and she loved her family and she loved her kids, and that this was more so just a case of her being over-medicated and sick. And again, like I talked about before, postpartum depression, anxiety, psychosis, anything like that is such a scary and real thing, and these things are not talked about enough. So it is such a possibility that, she was struggling with postpartum psychosis, whether she was diagnosed with it or not. She could have had a psychosis episode. And another thing that I forgot to mention that we did hear from the prosecution, her husband had gotten a phone call from her in the hospital. I think it was the day before the hearing on Tuesday. And she told him what she did, and she told him that she heard a man's voice in her head that was telling her that this was her last chance to do this and that she had to kill her kids and kill herself. And that going to postpartum psychosis, you can have hallucinations, you can have delusions and paranoia and just behavioral changes. And you can hear people talking to you or telling you to do things. These things are very, very real. So this could very well have been a case of postpartum psychosis or other things. But again, obviously the prosecution is arguing that that was never something that she struggled with, or psychosis was never a word that came out of her mouth. So towards the end of the hearing, I think one of the things that makes this case unique is that they're kind of talking about what the next steps for her are. So, on one side, prosecution is saying that she needs to go to jail. And on the other side, the defense is saying she would do much better in a rehab facility or somewhere that she can have 24-hour around-the-clock care. A defense is saying, she needs 24-hour care right now. She's on suicide watch. She's very suicidal, and now paired with her physical issues, she needs a lot of help. So I think they're just trying to figure out where to go next with this and what's the next step for her. But with that being said, that is all that I have for you guys this week. Like I said, we will definitely be talking about this case next week and going more into depth about what happened, and hopefully we'll have some new updates as well by then. And we'll get to hear Ashley's take on it and kind of get her opinion and what she thinks about the case. But with that being said, thank you guys so much for listening today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. And as always, stay safe and have a great weekend.